I discovered my husband had been faking his illness for years to avoid working while I supported the family. The morning I found those medical bills hidden in his desk drawer changed everything about my life. For 8 years, I had been killing myself working 2 jobs to support our household while he stayed home with what he claimed was a chronic back condition that made it impossible for him to work. The bills were addressed to someone with a completely different name but the same address, and they were for treatments he had never mentioned to me. My hands were shaking as I went through the paperwork piece by piece. Physical therapy appointments he had never told me about. Doctor visits scheduled during times when he said he was too sick to leave the house. And most shocking of all, clearance letters stating he was fit for full-time work dating back 3 years. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest, making it hard to breathe. I had been getting up at 5 in the morning to work at a diner, then rushing home to check on him before heading to my evening shift at a retail store. My feet ached constantly, my back hurt from being on my feet all day, and I had developed stress headaches that kept me awake at night. Meanwhile, he spent his days playing video games, watching television, and complaining about how much pain he was in whenever I suggested he try to find some kind of work he could do from home. The worst part was remembering all the times I had felt guilty for being frustrated with our situation. When I would come home exhausted and find him relaxing on the couch, he would immediately start groaning and holding his back, talking about how he had been in agony all day. I would feel terrible for even thinking about asking him to help with household chores or contribute financially. He had trained me to feel like a horrible person for wanting a partner instead of a dependent. Looking back, there were so many red flags I had ignored or explained away. He never wanted to go to doctor appointments together, claiming he was embarrassed about his condition. He refused to apply for disability benefits, saying the process was too stressful and would make his symptoms worse. When I suggested he try working from home or doing freelance work, he would get angry and accuse me of not understanding how serious his condition was. The financial stress had been crushing me for years. We lived in a tiny apartment because it was all I could afford on my wages. I had to give up my car and take the bus everywhere because we couldn't afford the payments and insurance. I hadn't bought myself new clothes in over 2 years, and I had been putting off going to the dentist because we couldn't afford the copay. Every month was a struggle to pay rent, utilities, and groceries, while he acted like money just appeared magically. I started thinking about all the sacrifices I had made for our relationship. I had turned down job opportunities that would have required moving to other cities because he said his doctors were here, and he couldn't handle the stress of relocating. I had stopped seeing most of my friends because I was always working or too tired to socialize. My sister had tried to talk to me about the situation several times, but I had defended him, and eventually she stopped bringing it up. The day I confronted him about the medical bills was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. He initially tried to deny everything, claiming the bills were a mistake or that someone had stolen his identity. When I showed him the clearance letters with his signature, he broke down crying and admitted he had been lying about the severity of his condition. He said he had started exaggerating his symptoms because he was afraid of working, and it had just gotten out of control. His explanation made me angrier than the original lie. He talked about his anxiety and fear of failure, as if they justified 8 years of deception and financial abuse. He begged me to understand that he had never meant to hurt me, that he had been planning to go back to work eventually. The manipulation was so transparent once I could see it clearly. But it made me realize how many times he had used emotional manipulation to control situations throughout our relationship. I didn't know what to do with all the rage and hurt I was feeling. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to make him understand how much damage he had done to my physical and mental health. Another part of me felt completely numb, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The person I had loved and supported for 8 years didn't actually exist, and I had to figure out how to process that reality. The practical implications were overwhelming. I had been supporting 2 people on wages meant for one, which meant I had no savings and terrible credit from all the times I had been late on bills. I was 32 years old and felt like I was starting over from nothing. The apartment lease was in both our names, and I couldn't afford to live there alone on my current income, but I also couldn't afford to move. I decided to stay with my sister for a few days while I figured out my next steps. She was incredibly supportive, but I could see the anger in her eyes when I told her the whole story. She had known something was wrong for years, but had stopped pushing because she didn't want to damage our relationship. Hearing her say she had suspected he was lying made me feel both validated and stupid for not seeing it myself. Going back to work after discovering the truth was torture. I kept thinking about how many extra shifts I had picked up to pay for his medication, how many times I had worked through being sick because we couldn't afford for me to miss a day. My coworkers had always been sympathetic about my situation, and now I felt embarrassed about all the times I had talked about how hard things were because of his condition. The humiliation was almost as bad as the betrayal. The confrontation with him, when I went back to collect my things, was devastating. He had clearly been crying for days, and the apartment was a mess. He begged me to give him another chance, promising he would get a job immediately and make up for everything. He said he would go to counseling to figure out why he had done this to us. The pathetic sight of him actually made me angrier because it felt like another manipulation tactic. I realized that even his breakdown felt calculated. He knew exactly what to say to make me feel guilty for leaving, talking about how he couldn't function without me and how sorry he was for everything. The same man who had been capable of maintaining an elaborate deception for 8 years suddenly acted helpless and confused when faced with consequences. It was like watching someone perform a role they had practiced. The legal aspects were complicated because we weren't married and most of our debts were in my name. I couldn't sue him for the money he had cost me over the years, and I couldn't force him to pay me back for all the expenses I had covered. The financial abuse had been perfectly legal because I had agreed to support him based on what I thought was a legitimate medical condition. The system offered no recourse for someone in my situation. Finding a new place to live was incredibly difficult on my income. I ended up renting a room in a house with 3 other people, which was a huge step down from having my own apartment. The adjustment to living with strangers again at my age was harder than I expected, especially because I was dealing with so much emotional turmoil. My new roommates were nice enough, but I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells. The most unexpected part of the whole situation was how much my work performance improved once I wasn't carrying the stress of supporting someone else. I had been so focused on just surviving financially that I hadn't realized how much mental energy the situation had been consuming. Within a few months, I was able to quit my second job and focus on advancing in my primary position. The relief of working normal hours again was incredible. I started taking evening classes to develop new skills, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for when I was working 2 jobs. The sense of investing in myself, instead of just trying to keep someone else afloat, was empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own future instead of being trapped by someone else's problems. The hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment again. I had been so thoroughly gaslit about the situation that I questioned my perception of everything. When friends would comment on how much happier I seemed, I would wonder if I was just being selfish or if I had really been as miserable as I remembered. The process of rebuilding my confidence in my own instincts took months. I had to completely reevaluate my understanding of our entire relationship. Things I had interpreted as him being caring and attentive now seemed like ways he had been managing me to maintain his comfortable situation. The way he would bring me coffee in the morning before work, the way he would rub my feet when I came home exhausted, the way he would listen to me vent about difficult customers. It all felt tainted by the knowledge that he had been lying about the fundamental basis of our partnership. The discovery that he had been collecting unemployment benefits for 2 years while claiming to be too disabled to work was like finding out about the affair all over again. He had been committing fraud while I worked myself to exhaustion, and the money he was collecting illegally could have solved so many of our financial problems. The betrayal felt deeper every time I uncovered another layer of his deception. I found out through mutual friends that he had gotten a job within a month of my leaving, which confirmed that his physical limitations had been largely fictional. The speed with which he suddenly became employable when faced with having to support himself was almost comical if it wasn't so infuriating. He had been perfectly capable of working the entire time, but had chosen to let me sacrifice my health and well-being instead. The emotional aftermath was more complex than I had expected. Along with the anger and hurt, I felt a strange sense of grief for the life I thought I had been living. The version of our relationship that existed in my mind had been based on lies, but the feelings I had experienced were real. I had to mourn the loss of what I thought was a loving partnership built on mutual support and sacrifice. My relationship with my family improved dramatically once I was out of that situation. I hadn't realized how much stress I had been carrying until it was gone, and I became much more present and engaged when spending time with them. My sister later told me that she had been worried about my health for years because I always looked exhausted and stressed when she saw me. The dating world felt impossible to navigate after what I had been through. How do you explain to someone that you had been in a relationship for 8 years with someone who was essentially a professional liar? How do you trust your own judgment about new people when you had been so thoroughly deceived by someone you lived with every day? The idea of being vulnerable with someone again felt terrifying. I started volunteering at a local community center, partly to meet new people and partly to feel like I was contributing to something positive. Working with families who were struggling financially gave me perspective on my own situation and helped me feel less sorry for myself. Many of the people I met were dealing with much more serious problems than mine, and their resilience inspired me. The most surprising discovery was how much I enjoyed living alone for the first time in my adult life. I had gone straight from my family home to living with roommates in college to living with him, and I had never experienced the freedom of making all my own decisions about my living space and daily routine. The peace and quiet of not having to manage someone else's emotions and needs was revelatory. I began to understand how much of my identity had been tied up in being the responsible one in the relationship. I had defined myself by my ability to handle everything and keep us afloat, and without that role, I had to figure out who I actually was. The process of rediscovering my own interests and preferences was both exciting and overwhelming. The financial recovery took longer than I expected, but it was steady. Without the burden of supporting two people, I was able to start saving money for the first time in years. I opened a separate savings account that he had no access to, and watching that balance grow became a source of incredible satisfaction. Every dollar I saved felt like reclaiming a piece of my independence. I eventually learned through the grapevine that he had tried to contact my family and friends after I left, attempting to get them to convince me to give him another chance. He told them he was getting help and had learned from his mistakes, using the same manipulation tactics he had used on me. Most of them saw through it, but a few initially felt sorry for him before they understood the full scope of what he had done. The realization that he had been researching his supposed condition online to make his symptoms seem more believable was perhaps the most chilling discovery. He had been studying medical websites and forums to learn how to fake a chronic illness convincingly. The level of premeditation involved in his deception was staggering and made me question everything I thought I knew about his character. Looking back now, I can see that the experience taught me invaluable lessons about setting boundaries and trusting my instincts. I had ignored so many red flags because I wanted to be supportive and understanding. But I learned that being a good partner doesn't mean accepting treatment that harms you. The relationship had been slowly destroying my physical and mental health, and I had been too close to the situation to see it clearly. The most important thing I learned was that love isn't enough to sustain a relationship built on lies and inequality. I had genuinely loved him and believed he loved me, but his actions showed that his comfort was more important to him than my well-being. Real love requires honesty, respect, and genuine care for your partner's needs, not just your own. My new life isn't perfect, but it's mine in a way that feels completely different from before. I make decisions based on what's best for me instead of what's easiest for someone else. I have goals and dreams that don't depend on managing someone else's problems. The freedom to be selfish with my time and energy still feels strange sometimes, but it's a good kind of strange. The experience also changed my perspective on helping others. I'm still a generous person, but I'm much more careful about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to make someone else's problems your responsibility. Helping someone should strengthen both people, not destroy one person to prop up another. 3 years later, I'm in a completely different place in my life. I have my own apartment, a career I actually enjoy, and relationships based on mutual respect and honesty. The person I was during those 8 years feels like a stranger to me now. Someone who had lost herself so completely that she didn't even realize she was disappearing. The journey back to myself was painful, but absolutely worth it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found those medical bills, if I had continued supporting him indefinitely while he pretended to be sick. The thought terrifies me because I know I would have eventually burned out completely, probably ending up with serious health problems of my own. The discovery that changed everything was actually the best thing that could have happened to me, even though it didn't feel that way at the time.